The family of the person you love spent the whole night talking about you. But what they said, Abou. Something shifted inside that house long after everyone thought the night was over. The lights were low. The conversations outside had gone quiet. But in one room, several people were still awake, sitting close together, speaking in voices that kept dropping whenever someone mentioned your name. Nobody was arguing. Nobody was angry. If anything, the room had become strangely emotional. One person stared at the floor for several seconds before finally saying, "I don't think they realize what they mean to this family." And then came the sentence that made everyone stop. Because what they said about you wasn't what you might expect. They weren't simply discussing the person you love. They were trying to understand something they had noticed for a long time, something about the way that person changes whenever your name enters the conversation. At first, the discussion was ordinary. Someone brought up your name casually, almost as if it were just another topic. But then the mood changed. A family member leaned forward and asked a question nobody had expected. "Do you think they actually understand how serious this is?" Silence followed. The person you love didn't answer immediately. They looked away, almost embarrassed, because they knew exactly what everyone was talking about. They had tried to keep their feelings private. They had avoided explaining certain things. They had acted as though everything was under control. But their family had been watching. They had noticed the little things, the sudden smile when your message appeared, the way their voice softened when they talked about you, the moments when they became unusually quiet after seeing your name. And suddenly, the family wasn't wondering whether you mattered. They were wondering how long it would take before the person you love finally admitted just how deeply you mattered. But there's one detail from that conversation you need to hear, because it changes the entire meaning of what happened that night. One of the older family members reportedly said something that made the room completely still. "Maybe we've been looking at this from the wrong side." Nobody interrupted. They waited. Then that person explained that they had spent enough time watching the situation from a distance to recognize something important. You weren't being discussed because you were a passing interest. You were being discussed because your presence had already made an impact. They remembered the moments when the person you love seemed more hopeful after talking to you. They remembered how certain conversations about the future somehow brought your name into them. And then someone asked the question that had apparently been sitting in the room all night: what if this isn't just a phase for them? The person you love lowered their eyes. For the first time, there was no easy answer. And what they said next revealed that this conversation had been building towards something much bigger than anyone expected. Then, just when the conversation seemed ready to end, someone quietly brought up the one thing everyone had been avoiding. The person you love had been asked before what they truly wanted, but they always found a way to change the subject. That night, however, the question landed differently. If you could choose without worrying about anyone else's opinion, what would you choose? The room became silent again. No television playing. No phones buzzing. Just the faint sound of the clock moving through the late hours. The person you love took a breath and finally spoke. They didn't give a dramatic speech. They simply said that when they imagined the future, there was someone they kept seeing in it. You. That admission changed the expressions around the room. One family member smiled. Another looked surprised, as though they had just received confirmation of something they had secretly suspected for months. And suddenly, the conversation wasn't about whether you were important. It was about what might happen if the two of you stopped allowing uncertainty to make decisions for you. What happened next was even more revealing. A family member started remembering specific moments involving you, small things that might have seemed meaningless at the time. The way you treated people. The patience you showed. The respect you offered without expecting anything in return. They weren't discussing appearances or temporary excitement. They were talking about character. Someone said that real relationships aren't always recognized through dramatic moments. Sometimes they're recognized through consistency, especially when nobody is watching. That observation seemed to touch the person you love deeply. Their expression softened, and for several seconds they said nothing. Then they admitted that one of the reasons they had been hesitant was because they didn't want to make a decision that could disappoint the people closest to them. But their family gave them an answer they apparently hadn't expected. They weren't asking for perfection. They wanted honesty. They wanted to know whether the connection they were seeing between you two was real. And the answer was becoming harder and harder to hide. If this story is already making you think about someone specific, you can share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoy these emotional stories, you're welcome to subscribe and stay connected for what comes next. Because the conversation didn't end with acceptance. It moved into something much more personal. One family member asked, "What do you think they need from you right now?" The person you love paused for a long time before answering. They said they didn't need you to prove anything. They didn't need grand promises. They simply wanted the chance to speak honestly without fear of being misunderstood. Then came a confession that nobody in the room seemed prepared for. They admitted that sometimes they had been distant, not because their feelings were disappearing, but because those feelings were becoming stronger than they knew how to handle. Their family listened carefully. And one person finally said, "Then maybe the real question isn't whether you care about them. Maybe it's whether you're brave enough to let them know." That sentence stayed in the room. But there was still one part of the night nobody had addressed. The exact thing the family had said about you when they thought the person you love wasn't listening. The room had grown quieter by then, but nobody was ready to leave. The conversation had moved past curiosity and into something deeply personal. Then one family member asked a question that instantly changed the atmosphere. "What do you think they believe about us?" The person you love looked confused. They hadn't expected the conversation to turn toward you in that way. Someone explained that they weren't only thinking about how you felt toward their relative. They were wondering whether you had ever felt accepted by the people around them. That question seemed to hit a sensitive place. The person you love admitted that they sometimes worried you might misunderstand the family's silence or distance. They explained that not every quiet reaction meant disapproval. Some people simply needed time to understand something important before speaking about it. And then another family member surprised everyone by saying they had actually been paying attention to you for much longer than anyone realized. They had noticed how carefully you carried yourself, how you listened, and how you never seemed interested in forcing your way into anyone's life. To them, that restraint said more than 100 promises could have. Then came the moment that nobody could have predicted. Someone reached for their phone, looked at an old conversation, and reminded the room of something you had said months earlier. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a simple expression of concern and kindness. But hearing it again changed the way the family looked at the situation. One person quietly said, "That's the kind of thing people remember." Another agreed, explaining that genuine character usually reveals itself in ordinary moments, not carefully planned ones. The person you love listened without interrupting. Their eyes became noticeably brighter, and for a moment, they looked down as though they were trying to keep their emotions under control. Then they admitted something that made the entire conversation feel different. They said that whenever life became confusing, talking to you somehow made things feel clearer. Not because you always had the answers, but because you made them feel understood. That was when someone finally smiled and said, "Now I understand why you keep coming back to this conversation." Suddenly, everyone knew there was more here than they had originally thought. But the most important part of the night wasn't what they said about your personality. It was what they believed your presence had changed. One family member explained that they had seen their relative become more thoughtful since meeting you. More patient. More willing to consider another person's feelings before reacting. They weren't claiming you had magically changed everything. They were simply recognizing a pattern that had become impossible to ignore. And then someone asked the question that had been waiting beneath the entire conversation: if you lost this person because you were too afraid to speak honestly, would you regret it? The room fell completely silent. The person you love stared ahead, clearly wrestling with the weight of the question. Then they whispered an answer so quietly that everyone had to lean closer to hear it. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a dramatic declaration. It was something much more revealing. And the moment their family heard those words, they realized the conversation about you had never really been about whether they approved of you. It had been about whether they were ready to help the person they love stop hiding what was already in their heart. The answer hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Nobody rushed to fill the silence, because everyone understood what had just been admitted. The person you love finally looked around the room and said they didn't want to keep pretending that you were simply someone they happened to know. You had become part of the way they thought about tomorrow. That sentence made one family member lean back slowly, almost as if they were putting several pieces together at once. They began talking about the difference between temporary excitement and something that quietly survives time, distance, uncertainty, and ordinary life. Then they said something unexpected: "Maybe that's why this has lasted." Nobody argued. Because they had all seen the same pattern. Even when you weren't around, your name kept finding its way into conversations. A story reminded them of you. A decision made them wonder what you would think. A quiet moment brought back something you had once said. Without realizing it, you had already become part of their family's conversations. But then the discussion took another turn. Someone asked whether you knew how highly they thought of you. The person you love shook their head. Probably not, they admitted. And that answer changed the mood again. One family member explained that people often underestimate the impression they leave because they remember their own mistakes more clearly than the good moments others remember. They said you might be wondering whether you were accepted, while the family had quietly been forming an entirely different opinion. They remembered your patience. Your manners. The way you didn't demand attention. The way you gave people room to speak. And one person said something particularly meaningful. You don't have to convince everyone you're worthy. Sometimes people simply need time to see what the person closest to them has already seen. The person you love became visibly emotional at that. They looked down at the table, smiled faintly, and admitted that hearing their family speak about you this way made one fear disappear, the fear that choosing honesty would mean choosing between you and the people they love. And just when everyone thought the conversation had reached its natural ending, a final question appeared. So what happens now? No one answered immediately. The person you love took a slow breath and said there was something they needed to do first. They needed to stop expecting you to read between the lines. They needed to stop assuming you already knew what they felt. They needed to communicate instead of hoping circumstances would somehow speak for them. That was the moment the family seemed to understand what the entire night had really been about. They hadn't gathered to judge you. They had gathered because they could see that someone they cared about was standing at an emotional crossroads. And now, after hours of talking, they weren't pushing that person away from you. They were encouraging them to be honest with you. One family member even smiled and said, "If you care about them that much, don't make them keep guessing." The person you love nodded slowly. And before the night finally ended, they made a quiet decision, one that could change the next conversation between you two completely. If you want to stay with this story, keep listening, because what happened after everyone went to sleep is where the meaning of that entire conversation becomes impossible to ignore. The house eventually became still, but the night wasn't finished with the person you love. Long after the conversation ended, they remained awake, sitting alone with the lights turned low, replaying every sentence their family had spoken. For the first time, they weren't wondering whether their feelings were real. They were wondering why they had spent so much time hiding them. Their phone rested beside them, screen dark, but their attention kept returning to it. Your name was somewhere inside that device, connected to conversations they had reread more times than they would ever admit. They opened one of those messages, read it slowly, and smiled. Then the smile faded into thought. They remembered moments when you had probably wondered why they suddenly became distant, why they sometimes took so long to respond, why they seemed ready to say something important and then stopped. The answer wasn't indifference. It was hesitation. And after everything their family had said, that hesitation suddenly felt much harder to justify. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of closing the conversation, they began typing. They wrote a few words, stopped, erased them, and tried again. This time, they weren't trying to sound impressive. They weren't trying to create the perfect message. They simply wanted to be honest. Their family had given them permission, in a way, to stop treating vulnerability like weakness. They had heard people they trusted describe you with warmth and respect, and it made them realize that perhaps the biggest obstacle had never been your feelings at all. It had been their fear of saying too much too soon. They remembered one particular moment when you had shown them patience without asking for anything in return. At the time, they had barely acknowledged it. Now, sitting alone in the quiet, they understood its importance. You had given them something rare. Space to be themselves without having to perform. And suddenly, the message they were writing became less about explaining the past and more about opening the door to something honest. Before the night was over, they made one final change to what they had written. They removed every excuse, every carefully chosen phrase, every sentence designed to protect them from embarrassment. What remained was simple and vulnerable. They wanted you to know that their silence had never meant you were unimportant. In fact, sometimes it meant the opposite. You mattered enough to make them afraid of getting it wrong. They stared at the screen for several seconds, their thumb hovering over the send button. Then they stopped. Not because they had changed their mind, but because one final thought crossed their mind: maybe they shouldn't send a message at all. Maybe they needed to tell you face to face. That possibility made their heart race. And as the first signs of morning began appearing beyond the window, they finally understood what their family had been trying to tell them all night. The next step wasn't about waiting for a perfect moment. It was about creating an honest one. And when they finally decided what they were going to say when they saw you, it was something their family never expected to hear. By morning, the decision had settled inside them. There was no dramatic announcement, no sudden transformation. Just a quiet certainty that hadn't been there the night before. They woke earlier than usual, walked into the kitchen, and found one family member already there. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then that person looked over and asked, "Did you figure out what you're going to do?" The person you love smiled faintly and nodded. They didn't explain everything. They didn't need to. Somehow, the family could tell that something had changed. The uncertainty that had followed them for so long had been replaced by intention. Before leaving the room, they said something simple: "I'm going to stop making them guess." That sentence carried more weight than any grand promise could have. Because the entire night had taught them something they hadn't fully understood before: feelings don't become clearer through endless silence. Sometimes clarity only arrives when someone finally decides to speak. Later that day, they found themselves thinking about the first time you two really connected. Not the obvious moment everyone would remember, but a small detail almost nobody else knew about. The expression on your face during an ordinary conversation. The way you listened before responding. The way you remembered something they had mentioned casually weeks earlier. That memory suddenly felt important. They realized that what had drawn them toward you wasn't one spectacular event. It was a collection of tiny moments that had accumulated quietly until they became impossible to dismiss. And now their family's conversation had given those memories a different meaning. They weren't looking for a perfect story anymore. They were recognizing a genuine connection that had developed naturally. For the first time, they allowed themselves to imagine what it would feel like to talk openly with you without calculating every word. No mixed signals. No carefully maintained distance. Just honesty. And that thought brought a calmness they hadn't expected. If you've ever found yourself wondering whether someone could care deeply while still struggling to express it, this story may feel familiar. And if these moments speak to you, you're welcome to share what part resonated with you and stay connected for more stories like this. But there was still one question left unanswered. What exactly had the family decided about you after talking through everything? Their opinion had clearly changed, but there was a specific conclusion they reached that the person you love carried with them throughout the entire day. Later, when another family member asked, "So, what did everyone say about them?" They didn't hesitate this time. They answered with a confidence that hadn't been there before. They said the family believed you deserved clarity, respect, and an honest conversation, not because they expected a certain outcome, but because they believed you should never have to wonder where you stand. And then they added one final thought: I think they're someone worth being honest with.